So, Lionel Jospin and the Parti Socialiste, they win the legislative elections of 1997. Their signature demand actually that had gained considerable popularity amongst the French people was their insistence that the French working week should be reduced to 35 hours a week. It was 39 hours a week level introduced by Francois Mitterrand. But now the Parti Socialiste was calling for the 35-hour week and what become known as the Aubry Laws, named after Martine Aubry, who was the French Minister for Social Affairs, who created the legislation in 1999, designing the 35-hour week laws. What essentially meant was that in theory, yes, everyone works 35 hours a week, but in reality, these hours are spread out over the year. And so what this allows French businesses to do is that in times when there's a downturn, they can give employees more time off and then insist that employees work more hours than 35 hours a week when things are very busy. However, nevertheless, this still means that French people in general are expected to work less hours a week. And of course, a key part of this was that they would be paid the exact same that they had been paid under the 39-hour week policy. Not surprisingly, this policy was not particularly popular amongst businesses, who insisted that it would destroy the French economy, whereas the Parti Socialiste claimed that it would create more jobs. And in reality, both claims didn't bear out. I mean, certainly it didn't really create a whole lot of new jobs, but the kind of economic doom and gloom that had been forecasted from the 35-hour week did not arrive either. Some of the other notable achievements of the plural left government, as it was known under Jospin. In 1997, they introduced a legalized what we call civil partnership, recognizing a kind of secular recognition of marriage, including extending it to same-sex partners. So it wasn't exactly a same-sex marriage, but an official state recognition of same-sex partnership. And actually, along those lines, in 2001, a member of the Parti Socialiste, Bertrand Delaunay, was elected mayor of Paris. He was the first openly gay French politician to be elected to such a high office. And it's worth bearing in mind it was only 7 or 8 years earlier that a French prime minister had been talking about how homosexuality was an alien part of French life. So that certainly marked a significant turnaround. There was also a greater demand for greater gender equality in French politics. In 1992, a collection of French female politicians had published this document encouraging female citizens to do more to demand gender equality in politics. In particular, what they wanted was for half the elected officials of France to be women and for legislation to represent that. Legislation was introduced in 2002 to kind of provide a step in that direction, but in reality what it said, not that half the elected officials had to be women, but that parties had to nominate half the party nominees for a political party had to be female. And what this often meant was that female candidates were relegated to districts or areas where they weren't expected to win anyway, so it didn't quite have the success that its advocates were kind of pushing for. One of the most notable events of France in the 1990s, of course, was World Cup 1998, which France hosted. Soccer, obviously, an incredibly popular sport in France. France had never won the World Cup, had not hosted the World Cup since 1938. So it was a big deal for French people to host this global competition. And of course, it all went horribly wrong when Zidane headbutted a guy in the final and got sent off. Actually, no need to worry, this is from the 2006 final, which didn't go particularly well for France. But in 1998, things happened to turn out better. So France actually win the World Cup in 1998, the first time France has ever won it, widely celebrated across France. And if the fact that the squad was made up of a variety of people from different backgrounds also kind of caused great celebration in French society. I mean, you can see the picture here. This is an ethnically very diverse team. The most prominent player on the team, this guy here, Zinedine Zidane, was of his parents were Algerian. And so for a brief moment in time, it seemed that some of the tensions involving France's immigrant community from Africa, especially from North Africa, and their ability to integrate with the French population had been overcome. Although, as we'll see, certainly those issues had not been totally put to bed. Another important innovation, or I guess constitutional development in France in the late 1990s came with the demand to change the French the term of the French presidency from a 7-year term to a 5-year term. And the reason that various politicians, both on their left and the right, wanted to change this was to avoid the cohabitation that had happened 3 times in the previous 17 years. That is, the idea was if you had 5-year terms and 5-year presidential terms and 5-year national legislative elections, that would mean, for the most part, presidents would not have to get stuck with a parliament that was of a different political persuasion from themselves. This, of course, required an amendment to the French Constitution, which, of course, required a referendum. And the referendum was held in 2000. And you can see that the choices in favour, it was actually a pretty large number of French people voted in favour of reducing the French presidency from 7 years to 5 years. And so that means that Jacques Chirac was the last French president who got to serve a 12-year term. So 2002 came along. 2002, of course, was the next election year. So the presidential office, and of course, whoever won the presidency in 2002 would only serve for 5 years. And Jacques Chirac wasn't a particularly popular French politician, but he was helped by the fact he didn't have any major gaullist rival who sought to challenge him for the office, as we had seen that what Chirac himself had done to Giscard d'Estaing in 1981. And he himself had faced another candidate in Raymond Barre in 1988. So he didn't have to deal with that. He was also helped by the fact that the Front National was quarrelling amongst themselves. It actually entered 2 different candidates into the French presidential election. So Chirac was not overly concerned that he would have to deal with a strong right-wing challenger to his presidency. Most people expected this would simply be a straight runoff between Chirac, the president, and Lionel Jospin, the French prime minister, whose popularity had started to sag a little bit. There had been an economic downturn, a global economic downturn in 2000, the year 2000, and that had affected Jospin's popularity to some extent. Most people expected that this would be a straight head-to-head battle between the two. However, and initially that's exactly what opinion polls were suggesting. It would just be the 2 men going head-to-head. But Jospin, as the leader of what we call the plural left, and so here, these are the Democratic candidates who ran for election in 2000. The point I'm making is that one of the criticisms was initially there were too many candidates running for president in the Democratic Party. Certainly, that was a criticism of what was happening in France in 1998 because 2002, because lots of different small parties from the left entered candidates. So Jospin was the leader of a coalition of left-wing parties, all of whom wanted to run their own candidate. And what that meant was that there was less of the left-wing pie to go around for Jospin. And just before the first round of elections, it became clear that Jospin was being beaten into third place by Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen. And so once the first round of elections came in, the big shock was that Le Pen edged out Lionel Jospin. So actually the figures are even close. I think it was 16.8 for, in fact, let's just jump to the next league. So you see there 16.8 for Le Pen, 16.2 for Jospin. But this was an enormous shock in the French national landscape that Jean-Marie Le Pen was certainly not loved in the French national scene. He was kind of openly racist, openly anti-Semitic, openly anti-European Union. And a lot of French people felt embarrassed that there was going to be a presidential runoff and Jean-Marie Le Pen was going to go head-to-head with Jacques Chirac. Lionel Jospin was absolutely humiliated by this turn of events. He immediately resigned as prime minister and quit politics and has never participated in politics since. And it also meant that for most French people, even though Chirac wasn't all that popular, and if you saw the actual number of figures he got, just to go back a second, I mean, it wasn't like he was a million miles ahead of Le Pen in terms of first preference in the first round. But most French people are kind of feeling a sense of embarrassment connected with Le Pen's candidacy, that this is someone from the extreme right wing getting to the final 2 was a cause of embarrassment, and the result was, for Chirac, a landslide. That will just show you the graphic here. So Chirac gets almost over 82% of the vote. Essentially what happened was, I mean, Le Pen's vote comes up a little bit, but only because the other National Front, the guy Bruno Maget, who ran as the National Front candidate, in the first round dropped out, obviously, and so Le Pen picked up his votes, but otherwise didn't pick up any other votes in this election. So, I mean, this was a record victory for any French president in a national election, and it kind of reflected the fact that Le Pen was simply seen as beyond the pale for the vast majority of French voters. In order to kind of capitalize on this success, Chirac and his followers created a new French political party, and you probably noticed this by this stage, that French political parties are much more fluid compared to political parties in the United Kingdom or the United States. The party of the Union, for the majority of the presidential majority, kind of combining a variety of right-wing parties together. They run in the elections, the National Assembly elections, which were held only a month after the presidential election, which were scheduled to be held in 2002, and the result is that a large majority comes back for the union of the presidential majority, and ensuring that Chirac, for the next 5 years of his term, is not going to have to face a hostile national legislature, and he appoints a young conservative, Raffrin's picture, he's a bit older here, Jean-Pierre Raffrin, as Prime Minister of France, as both a conservative politician, but also a politician who has a good rapport with French people, and is reasonably popular. So it seems that Chirac, after his dramatic electoral victory, is set for a period of strong government with little challenge for his rule over the next 5 years of his presidency.